able to do so for nearly 20 years. So if you can do that, that person is not disintegrating. Do you understand? Because disintegration suggests that, I mean, yes, in a sense, we are all disintegrating, we call it aging, right? Over the years, 70 or 80 for those of us who are strong. However, when we think about disintegration, we mean imminent disintegration, as in the person is dying, we need to bury that person soon. So 20 years was just a surprise for many, because the assumption was someone whose brain death was basically imminently dying. And Alan Schumann documented cases, not just one, but more than one, a bunch of cases where a brain deaf individual, though supported by technology in the same way that we have patients who are supported in an ICU, but actually less technical than that. I mean, she was able to bring him back, TK, back to her living room. You can't have an ICU unit in someone's living room. And yet she was able to care for him. And he went through puberty, so he underwent puberty. He grew up. When he got sick, he was able to heal himself. So his body was acting as a whole. So the integration was still present. And so given that an authentic anthropology presupposes that loss of integration is death, if the integration is still death, we have to assume the patient is still there. All right, so that's just in a very short summary of the current debate. Yes?
If the brain stem is part of the brain, and the brain stem is what's giving you a blood pressure, how could you possibly say that you have brain death if the patient is maintaining his blood pressure?
Well, no, I mean...
and the second point is, when things are dead, they don't have a blood supply. So part of your heart dies in a heart attack. Or maybe you get gangrene of your foot and you have an amputation. It doesn't have a blood supply. So not only if you're maintaining a blood pressure, you've got brainstem activity, which is part of the brain, and it's not rotting in your
so I think you're absolutely right. I think that maintaining a blood pressure and
the
I have to point out too that
this boy went through puberty means that his pituitary hypothalamic is intact.
So this is why I think you are raising the points for why there is now doubt in the whole debate, precisely because it is unclear how a brain-dead individual is able to maintain these functions which require the integration of the entire human being. And since death is the loss of integration, the presence of that integration suggests the person is not dead. And so this debate is ongoing. Yes, one more question.
It wasn't his comment. I personally had an in-law relative that was declared brain dead for 4 days in the Beth Israel Hospital. Wanted the mother to take her off all life support systems and all. Instead, the mother stayed beside her, talked to her all day for the 4 days. In 2 weeks, the girl was home taking care of herself.
No, I mean, one of the things too is I'm going to emphasize is that much of this that I'm going to present to you presupposes that the physician make an accurate diagnosis. And sometimes, often, it is difficult to make an accurate diagnosis regarding consciousness, especially since we're not exactly sure what consciousness is. Now here you've got a coma, you've got the absence of wakefulness and awareness, but here you have the presence of basic reflexes suggesting that not the entire brain is damaged. There are still parts of the brain that remain intact. Now, if you read the literature, and I'm not a physician myself, but if you read the medical and scientific literature, what you discover is that coma is an unstable state. In other words, someone who's in a coma is either going to eventually expire and die, or over time, the patient in a coma actually moves to a vegetative state. And so coma is unstable, and you end up basically moving to a vegetative state. So I'm going to point in just before we move to the vegetative state the locked-in syndrome, here you have the presence of wakefulness and awareness. So the person is just as conscious as you and I are conscious, but there is the absence of most voluntary movements. The only movement that is possible in an individual with locked-in syndrome is the horizontal movement of the eye and the movement of the eyelids. Everything else is completely lost. So I bring this up only because it's very easy to mistake locked-in syndrome for some of the other disorders of consciousness if you're not carefully looking for this. There's, I don't know if you've seen House, you know, the medical show. So one of the episodes dealt with locked-in syndrome, where you had an individual who was really unable to communicate except for subtle eye movements, and House, being the great diagnostician that he is, was able to pick that up. So we're now moving to, we've gone over brain death and coma and locked-in syndrome. I'm now going to focus in on the intermediate vegetative and minimally conscious. You should be aware that this state was only recently defined, and that for most of the last 50, 60 years, individuals in the vegetative state were simply vegetative. The minimally conscious state was defined in like the last 10 years or so, and you'll see how we're going to distinguish that. So the vegetative state, of course, made very famous by Terry Schiavo, 19 cases or so per million. To give you a sense, what you have here is wakefulness without awareness. And there are some incredible videos that if you haven't seen, you should see online. I wasn't sure if I could hook up the video, so I decided to just take a snapshot of Terry Schiavo. And here, Marie, the patient with whom I interacted with for 3 months before I was ordained to the Holy Priesthood, was also in this state. So she would actually go to sleep and wake up. And in the morning, she would wake up, and she would wake up, but there would be lack of awareness. So there would be rudimentary movements and sounds, but from all extensive purposes, she couldn't recognize you. She certainly couldn't communicate with you, but she was awake. Now, what's interesting is until, you know, if you're familiar with the debate over Terry Schiavo, there were people who would simply say, she's not a person anymore because she's not conscious. She's a vegetable, right? And so, very tragically and very sadly, her husband, who at the time, and this was the scandal of it, because her husband at the time was living with another woman, had a father, several children with her, and was actually in position to inherit money. I mean, you would think that we would recognize that someone like that would not be an objective individual for her care, but he, because of the current state of the laws of the time, he was given the legal proxy to act on her behalf, and therefore